Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Thank you for joining this GPStrategies webinar, where we'll explore best practices and innovative insights to help you and your organization improve performance.
Hello and welcome to everyone for joining today's panel discussion, Developing Remote and Hybrid Leaders with an Enterprise Scale Approach. My name is Kim Heyer. I'm with GPStrategies. I'm going to be the host for today's session. And before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of items. One, everyone's lines have been muted. And also, if you have any issues, technical issues, please submit a chat to me directly. My name is Kim Heyer. I'm the host, and I will do my best to help you if I can. And also, just to let everyone know, a link to the recording and the slides will be sent to you within 24 hours after the session today. And finally, we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So we encourage you to use the chat and chat with everyone to any kind of questions or any comments that you have to the presenters or your other attendees. So, and if you do have specific questions for the presenters, I ask that you use the Q&A option, and we are going to either try and answer them during the session, time permitting, or at the end of today's session. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I want to introduce you to today's moderator, facilitator, gal of all gals. This is Lisa Fagan-Joseph. She is a vice president at GPStrategies, focusing on providing clients with leadership development, employee engagement, coaching, mentoring solutions. She's built and deployed growth strategies, managed global and national sales teams, designed and executed alliance programs. Lisa also holds a bachelor's degree in marketing and communications from Florida Southern College. So we have a great session planned for you today. And with that, Lisa, I'm going to pass it over to you, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. So before I get started, I do want to extend some additional gratitude for some other folks that have helped us bring this session to you today. Kim Heyer certainly has played an important role in that, as has our marketing business partner, Hattie Kadri. Matt Donovan, who is our Chief Learning Innovation Officer, was someone that I had a chance to huddle with to bring some special thoughts to you today based on his research. And Katie Bailey, who you may hear from during the course of this webinar, who is our head of product development for leadership development. She's on the line as well. Do want to thank my team for bringing together this fantastic panel of clients of GPStrategies who have had varying degrees of experience with digital learning experiences for leaders in their organizations. So they're going to share their stories with you. But before we get into having conversation with our panelists, I just wanted to share 2 slides with you to just sort of set the stage and focus our conversation today. So if we just take a moment to take a look back at the evolution of learning, yes, it dates back to the caveman days when drawings were put on caveman walls to share learnings with other members of the family. But what we're really looking at today is how learning has been so accelerated in the last couple of years, especially for leadership development. Leadership development is a competency area, a category of learning that has been a holdout, really, as it relates to movement to a technology platform. And the reason is because there's this long-held belief that leaders are required to have interaction with their employees, with their direct reports. And that need for development of human connection has been the reason why people have long held the belief that that learning has to come through face-to-face interaction. So we know that leaders get promoted through their proficiency in the business, their competence in the job, and what they really need is oftentimes the development of those human skills. So the belief has been those human skills are best imparted, best taught in a face-to-face setting. Well, what's happened is, as a result of the pandemic, it has forced us to look at 2 things differently as it relates to leadership development. One is the fact that leaders are, the development of those leaders is even more important today than it ever has been. We've had so much change in leadership. in terms of the workforce and leaders retiring early and having to develop and upskill leaders quickly. And the fact that they now have to lead in a very different way than they ever have been before. So that's created this real magnified need to develop our leaders. And we now have to do it in a different way. We had to find a different way to develop those leaders. And so you're going to say to me, why not blended? Blended's been around for 20 years. I just use some blended solutions and bolt on some virtual instructor-led training sessions to create and address those leadership needs? Sure, you absolutely can. What we're going to talk about today is, Kim, if you go to the next slide, is just give into it some consideration to an alternative to blended. So let me give you a metaphor that will help a little bit with drawing a distinction between blended and digital. So this comes from someone I admire in our organization, our Chief Learning Innovation Officer, Matt Donovan. And I love this metaphor because it just creates a visual that is really sticky. So if you think about blended and relate blended to a chef salad, for instance, and you think of digital as a smoothie. On the chef salad side of the equation, what you have is you have a plate of different elements. You have your egg, you have your tomato, you have your cheese, you have your salad. And you can consume those different elements as you like. You can pick the pieces or the aspects of the salad that you want to eat. And those individual components, those different elements can stand alone. You can just have the egg if you want to. You can just have the tomato, or you could just eat the salad. On the other hand, with a smoothie, you have something that's integrated. You have something that can't be deconstructed, if you will. You have to consume it in its entirety. Maybe you could pick out some seeds if you're doing a blended smoothie of strawberries, but really the reality is it cannot be deconstructed. So if you think in terms of blended being how you access components of learning and consume them versus a smoothie being related to digital and how you experience it, that's what it's really all about, is how you experience the learning in the flow of work, because digital brings moderators, coaches, gamification, social aspects to the learning experience that you don't get with blended. Okay. So I'm going to bring to you an introduction of our panelists here, but I see that Katie has come on camera. So I bet Katie has a question for me.
I do. I'd love to ask you a question related to the evolution of learning. So would you say that the evolution of learning has primarily been about learning technology, or is it broader than that?
So really, really good question. For purposes of discussion today, we are going to focus on leadership development on the technological platform, on a digital platform. However, Katie, you are right. The evolution of learning, the changes that we've seen are not strictly technology-based. They're not strictly platform-based. We are seeing the need to modify and develop new content. As you know, as our head of product, you know that our customers are facing similar skills that need to be developed as they've always faced. So the concept of engagement, emotional intelligence, those are still needed skills, but through the lens of the new work environment. So we're going to talk about that today a bit, but our focus will be on leadership development through a digital platform. So thank you for the question, Katie.
Of course.
All right, so let's take a moment to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Amy Kahn, who is the head of talent at Cabot Corporation. Amy has spent her 20-year career in talent management, working across industries for global companies, including Cabot, Vistaprint, Johnson & Johnson, and she was also in a consulting role for Personal Decisions International. I know of them as PDI, which was later acquired by Korn Ferry. So welcome, Amy. And she is on my screen 4 pictures down. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4. So thank you, Amy. Thanks for waving. All right, Karen Bradbury is the Vice President of Learning and Development for Unum. She's responsible for learning and development strategy for the entire company, with an emphasis on driving Unum's talent agenda, career development, and succession planning. So welcome, Karen. Thanks for being with us today. And Eric Vandersloot, who's at the top of my screen. Eric is the head of performance development at Vanguard. In that capacity, Eric is responsible for building leadership capabilities that meet the business needs of today while preparing his leaders for the future. So welcome, Eric. Thank you for being with us today. All right, so let's dive in. Let's get our audience engaged. And thank you, Kim, for going to the next slide. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to ask our audience to take a look at this question. How are you doing leadership training now? So is it instructor led? Is it virtual? Is it e-learning? Is it digital? Is it something else? Can you please give us some response to that question? In the meantime, while you are answering this poll question, I'm going to turn to our panelists who I'll ask to come off of mute. And I'm going to ask each of you to give me a sense of what is the percentage of learning that you have in either of these categories? What percentage of your leadership development falls into instructor led versus blended versus digital? Can you give me some idea of that? I'll start with you, Amy.
I'd say it would be tough for me to put into percentages, but maybe 10% instructor led. The bulk of ours is really virtual because of our global spread.
Mm-hmm.
And e-learning, I'd say, would be another 10%, and digital is brand new for us, so maybe 5%. So the rest of the majority of that would be in the virtual space. Lots of live discussions, bringing speakers together and opening that up for conversation.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Karen, how might you respond?
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty good combination, amongst the instructor-led virtual e-learning and digital. We definitely mix it up depending sometimes on the audience, depending on what the subject matter is, the curriculum, et cetera. But I'd say we're using all of these things.
All of them. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And no really one more so than the other.
I guess if I had to say, probably on the e-learning is probably where that's probably the highest percentage. But I just find that especially from a leadership development perspective, having that blended, in this case on the digital side, definitely makes for a more engaging learning experience.
Okay, great, thank you. And Eric, how might you respond?
Yeah, so I would, similar to Karen in the sense that we use all 4, but I actually think the vast majority of our work right now lies in the digital space. We've created a lot of net new programs, specifically in a digital realm, and I think I'd probably put that at about 65% of our offer is digital.
Great, thank you. All right, so you're seeing, audience, you're seeing the difference in emphasis on different modalities, which is great. So we're going to have a really rich conversation about pros and cons and how you can succeed using these different modalities. So as I look at the chat, seeing a lot more of you are deploying VILTs as your primary means for leadership development. And it looks very similar to what our panelists have said here today. So thank you all for your responses. Let's go over to the next question if we could. I'd like to, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Kim. All right, so I want to ask all the panelists this question. It's kind of a twofold question, if you would please. One is, what were the triggers to have you consider digital as a means for leadership development? Why did you do it, and how are you doing it? So let me start with Eric.
Sure. I think the major prompt for us was really around the coronavirus and the move into remote work. I mean, it was a big move for this organization. Vanguard primarily had been instructor-led training. We had been very much a face-to-face culture. I think moving into the remote space became an area where we needed to figure out very quickly, how do we continue to develop and grow our leaders and our crew? And so digital became the way in which we were able to really do that. And I think one other thing to just very briefly mention is this idea of culture, and culture is a really big part of who we are here at Vanguard and how we operate. And so being able to figure out, how do we not lose the cultural touchstones and the cultural touch points that existed in person, and being able to pull them through in the digital space has been important work for us.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good explanation of the why. Can you tell me a little bit about what does it look like in Vanguard's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think in particular in the leadership space, it's developing net new programs for newly hired, newly promoted leaders at various levels. So that was new since I came in probably about 2.5 years ago. It was, we used to have a one-size-fits-all experience, and realized that we needed to do a little bit more around targeting leaders where they are in the course of their own journey, and partnering actually with GPStrategies to develop out what is a digital solution that would enable us to get to scale more readily. was a big part of that solution, and using social learning platforms, using Degreed, plugging in other elements into the kind of the total package of our talent development ecosystem was a way for us to really start thinking more on in a digital space.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just a quick comment or question, really. We know that when instructor-led was largely the means for developing leaders, that it was oftentimes a 2-day retreat where you brought all your leaders together, and that was sort of the belief that once you had them come through that 2-day retreat, that they then had the adoption of the skills that you were looking for them to take on. Would you say that this allows you to extend that learning in a more paced way, in kind of the flow of the work, and potentially be more sustainable?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, if you extrapolate to 2 days, it's what, 16 plus hours of learning. We've expanded that over 12 weeks, typically for our journeys now. So it probably would have been a 2 to 3 day experience. Instead of doing that, now we're doing it over the course of 12 weeks. And what it does enable, I think, is a really important part of just adult learning and where we are right now on this journey, is building habits into the day-to-day workflow. So it's self-paced, there is some moderation, but you're moving at your own pace through the experience. And then we're really asking you to go practice and trial these new behaviors in the flow of your work. And that hopefully starts to sustain the learning over a period of time.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Let me come over to you, Karen. What were the triggers for you to give consideration to a digital deployment of learning for your leaders, and how are you doing it today?
So I'll talk about before COVID and during COVID. So before COVID, I think that's the way I think about my life at this point. But before COVID, we definitely did employ digital means for our leadership programs. We would do that because we're an enterprise company, we're in different locations, we're even in the UK and Ireland. And this allowed us to, start to engage the talent, the participants. It allowed us to be a lot more flexible, about when and how we would engage with the folks. But we always, in all of our leadership programs, had in-person sessions. So I'll give you an example of one program, which is our Accelerated Leadership Program, ALP, which is for individual contributors who are high potentials and who are interested in being managers and leaders. And so when COVID happened, all of a sudden our model no longer works. It's there. We were certainly not going to bring people together, during the couple of years that we were in the midst of COVID. And so we did something that I was a little skeptical about, which is, we went 100% virtual. And so we did that out of necessity. But I would say that the overall results were extremely good. The engagement, the friendships, the camaraderie, the relationships, the learning, was able to happen in a very meaningful way. And so in some ways, because my bias has been for you need to be in person, to really do all those things that I just mentioned, this showed me that you can do things a little bit differently and still be as effective and as impactful. So we were doing it a bit before, but then out of necessity, we were 100% digital for our leadership programs. And we are just getting back into in-person sessions now. I don't even think it's happened yet, but we're just starting to go down that path.
You're starting to consider it. And then just a quick follow-up question for you, Karen. And I do see some questions popping up in the chat. I may pepper those once I come over to Amy. Karen, when you're giving consideration to bringing some instructor-led back into your plans,
yes,
how does that look different from what you would have considered instructor-led training to address before COVID?
Okay, and we did do instructor-led training and development for our leadership programs. It was done virtually, we were doing that. But yes, being back in person, it just gives you the opportunity, to do things and have those impromptu conversations and read the audience and all of those things, that matter so much. So I think that going forward with our leadership development programs, we're going to be much more comfortable employing digital and means and using technology. It will give us more options, more flexibility. You know, it'll save a little bit on the budget. But we know now that it's not going to take away from the experience, especially if we do go down the hybrid path.
Yeah, yeah. And so it sounds to me like you're going to be more selective and intentional about when you employ an instructor-led.
Exactly.
Live instructor-led, not
Live,
virtual.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction.
Sure.
Okay, so Amy, let me ask you the same question then. What were the triggers for your organization to consider digital, and how are you doing it today?
Yeah, so our story is a bit different. We're about 4,100 employees, but we're spread across 27 different countries, 13 different languages. So any one of our sites only has about 100 people to them. So what that means is you don't have critical mass of, frontline leaders or mid-level leaders that all need training at the same time. We're a manufacturing organization. We tend to have relatively lean travel budgets. So bringing people in together for face-to-face instructor-led training is very complicated. So I've actually, for the entire 4.5 years I've been at Cabot, looking for good virtual options to run trainings. And COVID, one of the fortunate consequences of COVID has been now every other organization has needed this as well. And so there have been a lot of new developments in the market. But what prompted kind of going digital, what we were doing is we would use something like a LinkedIn Learning video or Harvard Managed Mentor course. They would do that as pre-work. We'd have a senior leader and one of our L&D professionals pair up and train or do a teach on that. And every few weeks, the class would get together on a particular topic. But what I consider different about the digital modality is by having a platform. So we've just piloted the GPStrategies Leadership Acceleration Program. Graduation was yesterday, which was lots of fun. It allows you to house the content and allows people to work asynchronously. And then we still did blended learning, though, where we'd have senior leaders come in and talk on specific topics aligned with the content. But through this platform, we get access to much richer content. So instead of just one video or one concept, there's basically like 5 really robust ways of thinking about this topic and then being able to come together to have a meaningful dialogue. And so it really was a way to kind of step up and enrich the content. The idea, we do have a manufacturing base that 60% of the people aren't in front of their computers. We do have a highly tenured organization, so we weren't sure if things like point systems and modality, the kind of that gamification was really going to work. It really was quite successful in helping people measure how well they're moving through the program. So we've been quite happy with it, but it really is a very recent development for us and one that we're quite pleased with.
Yeah, it's great. It's really great to hear the different perspectives and the different journeys that each of you are on in terms of the evolution of your respective learning and development for your leaders in your organization. I did see one question in the chat that I want to go ahead and pose right now. And I also want to address another question. I saw something pop up in the chat that related to measurement. We're going to talk about results a little further into the presentation. So bear with us for those of you that were asking the question about how you measure. And then what I'd like to do is go to the next slide, if I could, please. And this is really getting at something that Eric said. I heard you say that we really needed to get to our leaders at scale, that we had people in dispersed parts of the world. Amy said the same thing. So I want to pose a chat question to the audience, simply to ask you all to tell us, where are you at in terms of your current work environment in your organization? Are you fully remote? Are you hybrid? Is everyone back in the office today? Just yesterday, I heard on the news that Shanghai is back on lockdown. And so I know this may be a bit of a fluid thing because of, these constant mutations of COVID, but just based on what you know today, where do you stand relative to hybrid remote and back in the office? I'm seeing lots of hybrids come up, lots of remote, permanently hybrid. Thank you. Thank you for those responses. So let's go to the next slide, if I can. One of the things that we constantly deal with as learning professionals is this notion that we've got to upskill people quickly. And there's a lot of business pressure that requires us to do that, but it's really magnified today as a result of COVID because we've had so much movement in the workforce. We've had people come out of the workforce that were in leadership roles, people who have just chosen to retire, or for whatever reason have left the business, and we've had to upskill people into those roles. So it's an added pressure today that even though that's been a kind of an evergreen issue for us as leadership development providers. So I'm going to come over to you, Karen, and ask, how has digital helped you specifically with this issue of speed to competence?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A couple of years ago, we, made the decision to really focus on the concept and the practice of upskilling and reskilling. It was something that our leaders were asking about over and over again. I think from the perspective of, I think the point you made around if we have a situation where, we are missing a skill or we have a group that is, maybe going through a change, like how do we bring them up to speed? But also thinking to the future, like what are those skills that are missing in our company? So we had a lot of opinions, a lot of feedback on the question of what are those skills, but we ended up focusing on data and analytics and digital fluency. And so we used technology. We partnered with a company who could help us in terms of like, what's the curriculum? What is the actual program that people will go through in order to learn these specific skills? And of course, that had to include assessments. It had to include, kind of a baseline in the beginning and then at the end of the program. It had to involve an opportunity to get the help, that someone might need if they needed additional support or tutoring or what it is that you might need. And so this is really a starting point for us. I was just in, our planning meeting earlier today with our leaders in HR, and this is probably one of the most important things that we have on our plan for this year and going into next year. And so technology really helps, but getting clarity on what those skills are is extremely important. And then the third thing I'll say is, in our opinion, if we build it, they will come. Sometimes the challenge is that we have built it, but it's been a bit of a challenge sometimes in the business to free up people's time to be able to do that. So that's the other challenge that we're dealing with.
Yeah, well, that actually takes us to the next question, which I'm going to bring over to Amy. So if we can go to the next slide, and just let me insert a response to a question that I saw come through the chat that related to all of you. And so the question was, are you all talking about doing your digital deployments in terms of cohorts or individuals? And the answer to that question, that's safe to say, is that you're all doing cohort-based learning at this point when it comes to your digital deployments. Do I see head nods across the three of you?
I'd say from a leadership perspective, it's cohort, but if we're talking more broadly about skill development, it would not be.
Okay, gotcha. All right, thank you.
Similarly, we do have leadership development cohorts, but then we have self-directed learning.
Gotcha. That's the blended piece that you mentioned earlier, right, Amy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Erica, similar?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me come over to this question for you, Amy, and it's essentially what Karen just said. How do we leverage digital to get more commitment to the learning for our leaders?
It's really interesting because it's both a pro and a con. So we have a culture that if we've got a senior leader coming to speak, they show up and they like that. And that's what they remember and that's what they retain. If you assign them homework and it's something they need to do on their own, they're very busy and they can get distracted and they don't always follow. And so, we did have, you can use the points as a way of monitoring how people are doing and then checking in with them, with their leaders, with their HR person, say, you seem to be falling behind the rest of the cohort. How are things going? But, I think one of the things, Laura Silva, who is the facilitator of this program on my team, has noted is it serves as a really good opportunity. The ones who really engage, you get to practice. So you're able to learn the information, reflect, apply it, and bring that through multiple, both in your own and then when you're coming to the group sessions. So I think that's nice. And I do think some people who take learning seriously will always make time for it. Others, it's going to be forced.
Yeah.
But I think the answer to this is honestly, it's mixed. I think asynchronous does allow you to think and explore concepts more deeply, but you have to make the time. And I think you've got to have the culture that emphasizes the need for learning, and having their leaders inquiring and expressing interest in what are they learning makes a big difference in helping to build in that time and carve that out.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. If we could go to the next question, please, Kim. All right, so I'm going to bring this one to you, Eric. So we talk a lot about it. We have so far talked a lot about the dispersed workforce and what that means potentially to engagement, and how do we create that sense of connection? How has leveraging a digital solution for your leaders help to create that sense of connection, which I think ties to what Amy was just talking about, that creates a sense of accountability and obligation to partake in the learning. But let me hear from you on how you see digital helping to solve that problem.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think obviously the platform that we're using encourages and even in some ways requires that participants are connected, are sharing insights, sharing information, sharing best practice, are posting videos, are using the technology to really connect. And I think, I came from an organization prior to this where we talked a lot about the need for human connection and how important that is. And I think, if nothing else, COVID's taught us that the medium by which we interact is, it may shake things up a little bit, but connection is still extremely important. So there's things we could do in addition to putting the platform out there and having cohorts move through. There's, practices up front in advance of the session where you have people come together, even through digital teams or whatever the platform might be, to get to know one another, to build some of the shared experience. We have participants as a part of the design break off in small cohort groups and work together on day-to-day challenges and talk through their experience of what's happening. So, what we try to do is infuse as many connection points as we can throughout the course of the experience so that we start to build that collaboration, because just we still recognize how critically important that is, right? Where we want to be able to hear from and learn from others and be able to really kind of connect with what's happening across the organization. And it's the platform enables a lot of that. And then we also go to the next level of how do you break people out into smaller groups and be able to continue that practice.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you all a question. In your digital deployments, we have seen more and more, to your point, Eric, just now, requests to GPStrategies for us to enhance the design of our digital experiences by peppering in virtual instructor-led sessions, smaller cohorts, as you say, and to do exactly what you just described, which is to create those subgroups, if you will. Are you all doing the same thing? Is that what you mean when you're saying creating breakouts, Eric?
Yeah, that's it. Specifically in my world, it's like breaking out the participants into smaller groups and having them throughout the course of the 12 weeks meet 3, 4, 5 times throughout the experience, where that scheduled meetings, what they do ad hoc is really up to them. And then, as you all know, we've also incorporated coaches into the journey as well. So we've got coaches that are riding alongside of the leaders and really standing up some of these, virtual instructor-led courses, or holding open office hours for people to come and connect and have conversation and really work through some challenges with.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. Thank you for that. I'm going to go over to the next slide, and this is really going to be a question posed to both our audience today as well as to our panelists. But starting first with the folks, if you would please put into the chat, what are some of the benefits and challenges that you might be personally seeing as it relates to digital deployments of learning for your leaders? So if you would just go ahead and populate in the chat some of your benefits and challenges that you're seeing. While I come over to the panelists, I'd like to ask you to please share one benefit at least and one challenge that you're seeing with the deployment of digital for your leaders. And so let me start with you, Amy.
So I think I've hinted at some of these, but what I really like about it is having much more robust content. I'm seeing the conversations that come out of it to be much richer, and I think that's great. I don't know that I would call it trouble, but we do have some feedback from people that say we prefer face-to-face training. I think overall we've seen good adoption, but there's always going to be some people that would prefer to do it in person. I think some things are better done in person. So it's really about maximizing and optimizing each of the modalities in terms of what it can afford.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Amy. I'll go over to you, Eric, next. And if you could give us one benefit, one challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest benefit is scale. right? And really driving towards scale in a way that we wouldn't be able to without the digital enablement. I think the next evolution of that is like personalization at scale. And that's something that we've been talking about with my team. How do we get to that? But we're still a bit of a ways away from there. In terms of what has caused us trouble, I think there's the self-paced piece. In a time when everybody is super busy and there's so much going on in the environment, it can be difficult to find the time for the learner. So really setting some ground rules and some discipline up front around, hey, block your calendar for 2 hours a week, hold that. It's easy to say that. I think what we're learning is that the practice of actually doing that for our learners at times can be difficult, because it's easy to just say, I've got this pressing issue I need to get to, I'm going to push on this, right? So I think holding them accountable throughout the experience of the platform has been helpful. But that timing issue can be a challenge for some people. We're still trying to figure out how best to work through.
Yeah, that's an ever-present challenge, isn't it, Eric? Do you find that the moderator and the peer interaction helps with keeping people drawn into the platform and doing the work?
Yeah, I think it's like almost like any other social platform. There's a bit of FOMO going on, right? So, and then the competitive spirit of people to rank against and see how they're showing up in the leaderboards and what that means and what that looks like. So all of that combined with the moderator and set discussions, it helps keep people on track. But it's certainly like we're trying to navigate what's the right ideal length of time for these kind of experiences. Is it 8 weeks? Is it 12 weeks? Is it 6 weeks? Right? Where do you get the most lift, and where do you not lose the traction that you're hoping to gain?
Yeah. One last question for you, and I want to bring this question to Karen. Eric, when you mentioned scale, obviously each of you have different organizational dynamics that you're having to navigate around in your digital deployments. For Vanguard, what does scale mean? What's the size of your leadership population globally?
Yeah, so our leadership population globally is probably about 6,000 or so leaders. And we haven't even scratched the full surface of that scale yet, right? We've been working through the deployments and rolling things out. I think we're finally starting to scale. We're really targeting newly hired, newly promoted to start, with an idea towards next year of saying, now we've got to get all our tenured leaders. So we're still building the muscle of scale, but the goal is to be able to really reach that population of 6,000 over the course of the next 2 years.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. Karen, let's talk about one benefit and one challenge that you're seeing.
Well, actually, I'm going to give you two benefits. So flexibility is great. You don't have to travel. You can do it from wherever, and if it's not, like instructor led, you can do it whatever time of day makes sense. So I like that. I also like the tracking, that can be done more easily through using digital means, for leadership development. So you have that in the LMS, and that can be helpful. And this is probably it says more about me than anybody else, but the downside could be distractions. I just find it a little bit easier to be distracted. And I've heard that from some others as well, versus being in person, versus like all eyes are kind of, on each other. People tend to, I think, be less in general distracted, when they're in person. But I think there are so many upsides, to having the digital option, that it's still a winner for me.
Yeah, your comments really resonated with someone that I saw pop in the chat. I'm a nighttime learner. I want to be able to do some of my leadership development on my own time evening. Yeah. So thank you, Karen. All right, let's go over to the next slide. This is probably the $1 million question for all of us, and it's one that we've constantly had to answer regardless of modality, right? And that is, what is the payoff? What are the results that you're seeing? So I'm going to take this question to each of the panelists. I'd like to start with you, Amy. Can you talk a little bit? You're just coming out of a graduation for your first cohort. What are some of the things that you're hearing that suggest that this is working? What are the results?
So very early on, actually, when we were still, I'd say in the first third of the program, we started getting that word of mouth feedback from people that aren't in the program, but it was still coming in as very, very positive, which that's to me pretty unusual. And so I take that as a very good sign from a qualitative standpoint. And we continue to see good feedback coming in when we ask for just feedback, or whether it's solicited or not. On the quantitative work, my team is very smart about this, and they did a pre and a post measure, and we saw 50% increase on some of the items in terms of like what were the learning objectives, where are we trying to see an impact or a change in behavior, and so I think that helps us a lot. As this is our first deployment and we just graduated yesterday, we've not been able to track it yet to things like what do people then go on to do with their careers. We always like to map our trainings to things like promotion or career changes, expanded roles, ways of seeing if it's having an impact, as we're not at the point where we're linking it to things like performance ratings or other things like that. But I will be doing that moving forward as well. And then the point system also, as I mentioned, was a good way of just tracking level of engagement in which people were really digesting and using the content. But I think it was a really nice, what I was very pleased with is the blend of quantitative and qualitative ways of engaging and checking in with people.
So Amy, you mentioned that there was a lot of good feedback coming out of some of the comments that you're hearing coming out of this first cohort that has been through. Can you give us an example of a couple of those comments that you've heard?
So one of the comments came from the type of person who they even said something like, I don't typically like these online learnings or these virtual experiences, but they found it really rich and engaging. And so they thought both the content that they were viewing on their own, as well as our leaders coming together for our blended learning experiences and being authentic and open in the challenges they face as leaders, they felt it was a nice complement to each other. So that's one thing that we're hearing. And I think people really engaged over, you can talk to each other through this platform quite nicely and built relationships across functions and geographies and business groups that they'd normally not have contact with. And they also really appreciate that, to see what the shared leadership challenges are that people face and hear from each other on how to think about these concepts and address them.
I heard you mention, and then I'm going to take this question over to you, Eric. I heard you mention that you're not quite there yet, but you're giving some consideration to incorporating some of the results into performance reviews. There was a question just now in the chat about whether or not you were doing that. So that's a planned thing for you, Amy, down the road, it sounds like. Karen, Eric, is that something that you're currently doing, incorporating some of the results from or the completion information from these journeys into performance reviews?
We haven't gone to the level of integration with the performance reviews yet, but it's actually a really interesting thought, right? How do we pull that forward? How do we hold leaders accountable for continuing to grow and develop? And what's that mean from a scale perspective? How do we measure that? What's that look like? So.
Yeah. And I'm seeing Karen nod her head yes as well.
Yeah, same answer with Eric. Yeah.
Great.
That's a good idea.
Thank you. Let me come back to this main question for you, Eric. What are the results that you're seeing? What's the payoff that you're seeing so far?
Yeah, so it's probably two years into the experience here at Vanguard, and so what we've been tracking is obviously, like many of you out there, tracking NFS, thinking about what are some of the early indicators of, is this program working? Where are people? How favorable is it? It's receiving really great early indicators that it's working. But then more importantly, we're also tracking and looking at what's it mean for engagement, retention, and advancement, right? And as I said, we're targeting either newly hired or newly promoted. So they're people that are relatively net new to the role that they're in, but 12 to 18 months post the experience. And we've got some data now to show and shares. We've seen 94% retention rates, which in this organization at this point in time is actually really favorable, right? We know that the talent marketplace is kind of crazy. We're holding on to people. We're seeing that they're staying. They're going through the experiences. They see development as an opportunity for further career development and promotion opportunities. We've also seen engagement levels rise, and so those two as indicators of early success are really impressive for us. We've been really happy with the results coming out of that. The favorability scores, as I mentioned, are also really high. So feel really good about that. And then qualitatively, we've been going out and surveying and talking to the participants and then using the input and the insights from their experience to further refine the program. And we've made some tweaks along the way. We've used some data from the Intrepid platform to better understand where are people really invested in their time, what's that look like, and where are they not, where are they pulling back and maybe skipping over some content. So how do we look at that and really think about, how that informs the future state development and design of the programs themselves?
That's great. Thank you, Eric. It sounds pretty robust, actually. And for 2 years in, it sounds like you're getting some really rich data coming back already. So thank you. Karen, how about you? What results are you seeing so far?
Yeah, I mean, the results have continued to be good. I would say that we're looking at the same measures that we've typically looked at, whether it was in person, it was digital, or it was a hybrid. But we have the ability, we do engagement surveys every year. We do, pulse surveys every 6 months or so. We can go into, we can look at the engagement of folks that have completed programs and to see, is there any difference there? And what we find is that the answer is yes, that it's higher. We can look at performance. We look at potential. Does that change, over the the time that the person has completed the program and is in the company? Do we see their potential for future positions continuing to go up? We look at promotions, of course. We also look at, quite often, our programs will involve projects. So, our completely digital program that we did last year, our leadership program, still involved everybody having a project, and they'd work together as a group, small groups. And so we look at, is there actual implementation of the project? Is there anything that's coming from that? And then we look at retention. And then finally, it's that anecdotal, qualitative feedback from managers and participants. Has this made a difference? And if yes, what is that difference? So, I mean, it's all the things that we look at as measures of whether or not this is making a difference for our workforce and for our company.
Yeah, so whatever you were doing before you employed digital, you're basically porting that into your digital process and saying, we want to get the same data.
Yeah, I mean, we could get into the nitty gritty of, some of our courses, are some better than others in terms of, so we can take it to that level as well.
That's excellent. Great. Thank you. So what I'd like to do right now, before we come over to, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share some final words of wisdom in their experience in employing digital. Before I do, there's a couple of things that I'd like to do. First of all, I want to let everyone know that has been commenting in the chat that we will have a Q&A after these final thoughts. So we'll have an opportunity to pick off some of these questions that are in the chat or to let you ask some new questions. So we will have some space and time to do that before the end of the webinar. I also want to throw out a sort of a kind of a strange question, perhaps, to you to answer in the chat for us. And it's really to say, all of this talk about digital and different blended approaches to learning today, what does that mean for instructor-led training? Is instructor-led training on the verge of going away? Is it going to die? In your view, in your opinion, if you want to comment on that in the chat. I think we've heard from our panelists today to say they still see a place for instructor-led. They may be more intentional about how they use instructor-led training, and still the emphasis is on blended and digital for the moment. GPStrategies' point of view, very similar, and you're going to be hearing in the coming weeks some more thought leadership from GPStrategies about what we believe to be the future of instructor-led and how it fits into leadership development plans. So for now, I'd like to come back to our panelists and ask for some final thoughts. What words of wisdom will you share with our audience today before we go to Q&A? So I'd love to start with you, Amy, if we could.
Certainly. I think fundamentally it comes down to the same core principles of, for leadership development to be successful, you need an audience that's open and interested in learning. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a learning culture and the benefit that gets you. With the digital learning, we do have a population that isn't used to this being a preferred method of learning, whereas now, incoming employees in the younger generations, this is what they expect and how they want to engage. And so you do have to work through some of the challenges of just getting people used to the idea of, yep, you got to log on and make the time for these things. We did have a number of people say, this takes more like 2 to 4 hours. We were told up to 2 hours. But again, I think if people are motivated to learn and they find the content rich, they're going to show up. And so I think that's important. But I think the other key for us is we really did do it through blended learning. I know sometimes people do full asynchronous learning, and I think some cultures that's going to work very well, some company cultures. And I think you really just have to assess what really resonates for your people and your culture, what's going to get them showing up and being their best, and figure out a way to blend that into the program.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that advice, Amy. Karen, how about you?
Yeah, I would say that I think the same principles apply to digital learning as, if you're doing in-person or instructor-led learning. You've got to think about what the end user needs. You've got to think about, how they learn best, and you've got to think about what you can do to make it as engaging as and as helpful as it can be. So I think it's obviously you've got a different medium, you have different maybe opportunities to be creative, but the same principles apply to any kind of training, development, learning, opportunity. So that's how I think about digital learning. It gives us that maybe additional opportunity to be creative, but but the same principles apply.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Okay, Eric, any final words of wisdom before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Karen and Amy in terms of it still needs to be relevant, right? Content is still in some ways king. You got to draw people in, you got to make it relevant, you got to make it actionable, you have to make it purposeful for leaders to really jump in and actually want to engage in the learning. I think the culture is extremely important that surrounds the learning. And I think we're at the very beginning of a really interesting time, because I think where this ultimately leads us to is for us to better tailor solutions to meet people where they are in the course of their specific journey. And, this is the early stage of that. I think as we continue down this path of evolution, we'll get to a place where, we could really target you with very specific in the moment learning that will meet the needs that you have in your day to day. And it's exciting. It's an exciting frontier. I think it brings a lot of capability. So
yeah, I agree. It really is an exciting time. And my entire career, I haven't seen so much acceleration in different innovative ways to impart learning. So it has been an exciting time, although challenging time with the pandemic and all that is presented to our businesses. So I agree with you 100%. What I'd love to do now is I'm going to ask my colleagues, Katie and Kim, to help me with some of the questions that have come up in the chat, because I can't see them all. And if you can help me pose those to our panelists, please.
Sure thing. So we don't currently have any questions within Q&A. That's fine. If anyone has questions, you can feel free to let us know. And then I'm just looking to see if there's anything that we've not addressed here. It looks like a bunch have been addressed by our panelists here in the chat.
Great. I saw one comment in here, Katie, thank you. That it was really more of a statement. I'd like to get a reaction from our panelists to it. And it was from Dwayne Finn. And he essentially says, in his view, that on-demand and micro-learning is the way learning is going. What are your thoughts about that? Karen, I'm seeing you nod your head.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's definitely a big part of our approach at Unum for sure. And it's something that, given people's demand, just the demands they have on themselves, or what's being asked of them, you have to make it easy for them to learn. And for those of us that are easily distracted, and you really do, I think, get to people in a much better way if you can make it short, easy, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, conversely, we have a gentleman in the chat saying that ILT is the quickest and most effective way of developing confidence for particular competence for development of operational tasks. Instructors and learners can be co-located or not. So any reaction to that comment? Do you agree, disagree, add to?
I think that's a great point. I think Eric said something earlier to this point of, what is the skill or the knowledge you're trying to train, and then what's the best modality to do that. And so if you are trying to learn operational skills, so for instance, we have to fix manufacturing equipment, your maintenance providers, you need that person sitting there helping them understand where, what to do with the wrench, or how to check the digital panel with the latest set of data. Whereas other things you can do virtually. But I really do agree with the comment. I think on-demand learning, micro learning, just attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. Digital technology is enabling a lot of things that weren't available before. And one of the other things that I lead at Cabot is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's very common to talk about nudges. And so how do you just provide the right information the right way that they can pick it up and do it? as opposed to a big week-long training on leadership where you're cramming 500 concepts into their head and they might keep 2 of them. And
Right.
I do run programs like that at Kevin as well. But I think there's a time and a place for both, and you have to be very thoughtful around what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so true. Katie, I think you may have a question that's come in, so let me let you ask that.
Absolutely. And thank you, RJ. I saw that in the chat earlier. Thanks for bringing it forward again. So it's a 2-part question for the panelists. What value do you put on building corporate memory and capturing the tacit knowledge of the workforce? And then a follow on to the question is, how do you capture and grow that corporate memory?
Okay, who wants to take that one first?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in because it's one of the initiatives that we're looking at as a broad HR organization in 2023, because we do have, many people are retiring and trying to figure out how do you take the wisdom that they've, that they hold and capture it in this organization, and how do you collectively hold on to that? I think it's an interesting piece or it's an interesting dialogue that I've been having as well, though, is because the world is changing so quickly and in ways that we could never have imagined. I think, and prior to coming here, I was in consulting, and what we talk to a lot of organizations about is that knowledge that's embedded is really important to give people perspective about why we are where we are in the course of our journey. But that's not necessarily sufficient for the challenges our leaders are going to face into the future. So we've got to figure out how to balance those 2 tensions, because you've got to pay respect to the past and all the great work that's been done. But the people that are leaving actually also need to understand that knowledge may no longer be sufficient for what the future generations need. And we've got to find a balance between the 2. How do you capture that? How do you hold that? And how do you teach some of that while also understanding that there's a whole new world out there that we've got to be able to figure out, and we've got to be really quick to adapt to. So it's a bit of a paradox. It's an interesting question. I can't say that we've figured it out. We haven't gotten a solution for it, but it is something that we're actively looking into and trying to figure out how to solve.
I think a lot of organizations are trying to really advance how to crack the code on this one, for sure. So thank you for your perspective on that, Eric. Let me allow one more question here before we wrap up, because we are coming up on time. There's a question in the chat that I just saw pop up from Kirsten Jackson. Hi, Kirsten, by the way. I know Kirsten Jackson from MetLife. Thank you for joining us today. She's asking, how about hybrid learning for leadership? Is anyone hosting learning both in person and virtual at the same time? We want to be intentional about using our office space for uses like development opportunities, while being inclusive of those who are not in the office. So any one of the panelists want to take that question? Doing hybrid learning.
I would say the closest thing that we're doing is in the DE&I space. We have ERGs, employee resource groups, that will host live events in person, and then we'll do virtual events as a way to keep people connected on the same topic. But it's not as structured or designed as true hybrid learning in the way that I think she's suggesting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Amy, any other comments, Karen? Were you going to?
Yeah, I would say, definitely hybrid for us. As I mentioned, in the past, we would have had greater emphasis on being together for those couple of sessions at the beginning of the program, at the end of the program. But I think we feel like we have a lot more flexibility, just knowing and experiencing how well it worked when we were in the midst of COVID. So I think that will be our plan going forward.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we are 1 minute away from wrap up. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kim to close out the session today. Do want to thank Eric, Karen, and Amy so much for being with us today, for sharing all of your great experience. Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, team. You guys did a great job. I too want to personally thank you for taking your time out today and joining us and sharing everything that you're doing within your organizations. For everybody who's out there, I want to thank you again for joining us and taking your time and attention to attend today's session. We hope you'll join us again for another upcoming webinar. Visit GPStrategies website to view future sessions. And I wish everyone on the call a wonderful and productive rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
This webinar is brought to you by GPStrategies. Together we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can access more webinars or download additional resources at gpstrategies.com/resource-library.